Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's Family Office Network's webinar series featuring IIX. Before we jump into the presentation, I would like to briefly introduce our speakers today. Mr. Robert Craybill, Chief Investment Officer, is joining us. In this role, Mr. Craybill leads all IIX's portfolio management activities with a focus on creating the most impact for underdeserved women and communities. He brings 20 years in the traditional capital markets as an advisor and investor, most recently as head of Asia Private Equity for Marathon Asset Management, a US $12 billion alternative investment manager. Ms. Natasha Gracha, Director of Innovative Finance, is also with us today. Natasha plays a key role in the development of IIX. At the end of today's presentation, we will have time for Q&A. Please use your questions chat option on your screen to send over any questions you have so we can answer them accordingly. And with that said, Robert and Natasha, I'm going to let you take it from here.
Great. Thank you very much, Lindsay. And welcome to everyone joining us. So as Lindsay mentioned, I'm Robert Craybill. I'm originally from America, but I've been living in Asia for the past 16 years, originally as head of investment banking for Dresdner Kleinwort Wasserstein, and then as head of private equity for Marathon Asset Management. I joined IIX 11 years ago. We're going to be taking you through a presentation on the Women's Livelihood Bond, which we have structured and are about to offer to investors. So this is actually the third bond in our Women's Livelihood Bond series. I'll start though with a background on Impact Investment Exchange, and then talk to you about the first two bonds and the bond series, and then we'll talk about the details of the Women's Livelihood Bond 3, which we'll be selling to investors later this month. So with that, could we start the slideshow, please? Next slide, please. And next slide after the disclaimer, please. You can quickly read the legal disclaimer language, but I'll start with we have a video to play. Okay, are we going to show this brief video? This is a brief introduction to the Women's Livelihood Bond series. Well, this is meant to be a 2-minute overview of the Women's Livelihood Bond series. It does give a nice flavor for the what we're trying to accomplish with the Women's Livelihood Bond and give you some overview of the impact that's created on the ground. It doesn't look like it's working particularly well, though. So could I suggest we skip the video and just go to the first slide? Thank you. So let me, apologies for that. Let me just give a brief overview of Impact Investment Exchange, or IIX. So IIX is based in Singapore, where both Natasha and I are speaking to you from today. We were founded in 2009 in the wake of the financial crisis, and really just at the start of the impact investing movement. And I think it's no exaggeration to say that we are the pioneer in the impact investing sector, not only in Singapore, but in all of Southeast Asia. And we've been a leader for the past 11 years in the impact investing sector in South and Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. Our focus is on helping to channel impact investment capital to sustainable organizations operating within Asia that either are empowering women, combating climate change, or helping to empower the underprivileged in underserved communities in the less developed countries in the region. Next slide, please. So we started in 2009 with a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation. You may remember that the impact investment movement was just starting then, and Rockefeller was responsible actually for really driving a lot of the innovation in the early days of the impact investment movement. We have since then continued to work with the Rockefeller Foundation, but our work has also been recognized by many other global and US organizations. So we were awarded in 2017 by the Global Steering Group for Impact Investment, the Impact Market Builder of the Year award. And in the same year, our founder was honored with the Oslo Business for Peace Award, which is sometimes referred to as the Nobel Prize for Business. The Women's Livelihood Bond series that I'll be talking about in this presentation has also won a number of prestigious global awards. And we are, if we go to the next slide, please. The Women's Livelihood Bond, I'd like to give you just a very brief overview of what it is. So basically, through our work at Impact Investment Exchange, we have been helping to raise capital for organizations that have positive impact on society, on women, on the environment for 11 years now. But 4 years ago in 2016, we had the idea that we wanted to create a product that could raise capital at a larger scale and funnel that capital not just to one organization at a time, but to a portfolio of organizations. So we set up the Women's Livelihood Bond of One, which was actually launched in mid-2017. And it's effectively, for those of you, you're all in the finance industry, it's effectively an impact CLO. So we originate a portfolio of loans to organizations that are empowering women in Southeast Asia through their work. And then we sell a bond to fund those loans. The bond is paid back primarily from the interest and then eventually the return of principal on those loans, allows us to service the bond and pay coupons and eventually return principal to the bonds. The Women's Livelihood Bond 1, which we sold in 2017, really made history at the time as the first, really the very first gender lens investment, impact investment instrument listed on a stock exchange. It's listed here on the Singapore Exchange. We followed that up in 2020, in January of this year, with a $12 million issuance of the Women's Livelihood Bond 2. And we're now working on the Women's Livelihood Bond 3, which is expected to be about 2.5 times the size of the WLB2, building off the success and strong track record of those two instruments. Now, I will talk throughout the presentation. I'm likely to talk about IIX's role in the Women's Livelihood Bond, naturally, but we work with a wide variety of partners that are critical to the success of the bond. So first of all, while we are the structuring agent for the bond, and we are also portfolio manager, bringing together all of the organizations to which we lend the proceeds of the bond offering, we actually work with a number of global investment banks as placement agents for the bond. So Standard Chartered in particular is handling sales in the United States, but we're also working with DBS for Asian sales and ANZ for Australia and New Zealand. We are very fortunate to be supported by top-tier US law firms, Sherman & Sterling and Latham & Watkins, who actually work pro bono on this in recognition of the high social impact that we create through the bond. And we have, and I'll go into this in much more detail, but we have what we call blended finance credit support from both the US government and the government of Taiwan. So the US government acting through what's now known as the US International Development Finance Corporation, formerly OPIC, provides a partial guarantee of each of the loans that we make, which benefits the bondholders. And the Taiwanese government is providing first loss capital, which also reduces risk for the bondholders. We also have the backing of the United Nations and Global Affairs Canada, who provided support to us in structuring the bond. Next slide, please. So one of the key things that we were trying to accomplish when we structured the first of these women's livelihood bonds was to create an instrument that would enable a wide range of investors to invest in organizations that were having deep impact on empowering women in Southeast Asia. To do that, we realized we needed to create an instrument that was suitable for institutional investors, was suitable for family offices, was suitable for private banking channels. And I think the success of Women's Livelihood Bond 1 and 2 shows that we've accomplished that. Both bonds had a participation, were sold in part through private banking channels of our partner placement agents, and both also had significant participation from institutional investors and family offices. So the Women's Livelihood Bond, one of our key investors was a US-based family office, and quite a bit of the bond was sold through DBS's private banking network. The second Women's Livelihood Bond was, the anchor investor was a large US institution, Nuveen, and we also had an European institution and a wide range of family offices and high net worth individuals from across Europe, Australia, and New Zealand, as well as Singapore and Hong Kong. The next slide, please. I'll give a bit of an overview of how we think about risk and return and how impact plays into that. And so what I'll say is that because we're targeting institutional investors who have a fiduciary duty to invest, get a market, to get a full market rate of return on their investments, we realize that the Women's Livelihood Bond has to stack up on a pure risk return basis. And so while these are moderate return instruments, the Women's Livelihood Bond 2 offered a 4% coupon. They are, the risk they offer is commensurate with that return. So the risk is relatively low, and that reflects that that underlying the bond is a diversified portfolio of loans to mature organizations that we have vetted and performed due diligence on. That portfolio of loans all benefit from a partial guarantee from the US government, and the bondholders also are senior to first loss capital provided by a concessional financier. In the case of the WLB3, that will be, as I mentioned, the Taiwanese government. In WLB2, that was the Rockefeller Foundation. So we believe that bondholders are getting a modest return in return for taking only a modest amount of risk. We think impact, though, here is an additional element, and we do believe that the Women's Livelihood Bond offers investors in the fixed income market some of the deepest impact that they will find. While the Women's Livelihood Bond 3 is a social bond, we feel it goes well beyond most social bonds in terms of the depth of impact. But in a way, investors are getting that as an add-on, if you will, on top of a return that fully compensates for the risk they're taking. We also think, incidentally, maybe not incidentally, that investing in organizations that are having positive impacts on their communities actually reduces overall risk to bondholders. Next slide, please. So we have the benefit now that we're launching the Women's Livelihood Bond 3 of being able to look back on nearly 3.5 years of performance of the Women's Livelihood Bond 1 and about 9 months of performance of the Women's Livelihood Bond 2. Both bonds are 4-year bonds, so each has been making all scheduled coupon payments. The Women's Livelihood Bond 1, in fact, has already retired about 50% of the principal amount of that bond, and both bonds are on schedule to ultimately make all scheduled payments to bondholders and return bondholders capital. Neither bond has had to call on the USAID guarantee at all. Next slide, please. And I'll turn it over here to Natasha Garsha, who leads the impact assessment work that we do on all of the underlying borrowers, to talk a little bit more about the impact performance that we're aiming for here, and to talk specifically about the impact performance of the first 2 Women's Livelihood bonds. Natasha?
Thank you, Robert. So the Women's Livelihood Bond series has to date met or exceeded all its impact targets, both for the bond that we issued in July 2017, the WLB1, and the WLB2, which we issued in January of this year. To date, the bonds have collectively impacted over 300,000 women and girls in emerging markets here in Asia. We go one step beyond measuring the number of women who are impacted. We also measure the effectiveness of the capital that's used. And this is really to make the point that this is not philanthropy, it's not a dollar for a dollar. The whole idea of investing in women empowerment is to empower these women to lift themselves out of poverty, to increase their income, improve productivity, have better ownership of assets, access to skills, and access to market. And all of this helps us calculate what is known as a social return on investment. So for every dollar that goes in as an investment into the WLB series, so far we've generated an average of $3.5 of social value by empowering these women through sustainable livelihoods. The second point that I'll make on this slide very quickly is, even though the primary focus for the Women's Livelihood Bond series is in fact on building gender equality, and you'll see that we advance Sustainable Development Goal 5 under the United Nations global goals, we also, by empowering women, tend to touch many other lives as well, particularly those of their children who experience improved food, nutrition, and healthcare outcomes, as well as education outcomes, particularly their daughters. We see a direct correlation with improvements in poverty and inequality levels because women are typically left out of the financial system, and in times such as COVID are 1.8 times more likely to lose their job than a man. We also have positioned all of our investments to really allow women to become solutions to some of the biggest global challenges, whether that's investing in companies supporting female smallholder farmers to build food security in their region, or whether it's giving them access to clean energy sources so they're helping to mitigate the effects of climate change. So you'll actually see we advance a number of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals by investing in women empowerment. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that we are really building on the success of the WLB1 and WLB2 to issue the WLB3. Next slide, please, Yvonne. Thank you. The Women's Livelihood Bond 3 will be different in a few ways. The first and foremost is it will be larger in size than previous issuances. We've blanked that out here, but we're expecting between 25 to 30 million in terms of the size, aggregate size of the bonds that we will be issuing later this month. We will be conducting an impact assessment as we've done for all previous bonds. We spend an extensive amount of time putting together this predetermined portfolio of companies who balance risk, return, and impact, as Robert mentioned. But we spend a lot of time actually speaking directly to the women. So the impact is verified and authenticated by giving these women, who are the end beneficiaries, if you will, a voice in the investment process. And we'll be using a digital impact assessment tool to collect end data from thousands of women across the process. And that digital tool is called IIX Values. The third point I'll make is the bond will be listed. So as Robert mentioned, the Women's Livelihood Bond 1 back in 2017 was the first time in the world that you had a instrument designed by a woman and used the entire proceeds to invest in women of color in emerging markets, listed on a stock exchange and made history. The Women's Livelihood Bond 2 was also listed, as will the Women's Livelihood Bond 3B. The last differentiating factor is the COVID lens. As I mentioned, women are 1.8 times more likely to lose their job during the pandemic, and we really see the Women's Livelihood Bond as a direct solution to that, looking for companies that are responsive, resilient, or resistant to COVID. All the companies in the portfolio have gone through a COVID resilience check, as we call it, to make sure they're still able to absorb, deploy, and repay capital. But more than that, that they're really creating a tangible value on the ground for these women and empowering them to be solutions to the crisis through creating sustainable livelihoods for them so that they can build back better post the pandemic era as well. I'll now hand it back to Rob to talk more about the details of the structure for the Women's Livelihood Bond 3.
Thanks, Natasha. And if we can go to the next slide, I'll just give a little detail on the structure. So I went through this in general terms, but let me go through it a little more specifically. So as I mentioned, and we start by really originating a portfolio of loans. So we select borrowers, we select organizations that are, through their work, empowering women, offering sustainable livelihoods to women in the region, but doing so in a way that's financially sustainable and in a way that they as an organization are creditworthy. And so we spend a lot of time identifying these organizations and screening them, and then performing both an impact due diligence as well as a deep credit due diligence. So we select those organizations, we pre-select them. So at the time that you as an investor invests in the bond, you actually have full information disclosed in the information memorandum on each of those organizations. So full financial information as well as impact information. So we start by selecting those organizations. We then establish a special purpose vehicle that issues a bond. And the bond proceeds account for about 90% of the capital that the SPV raises. We also sell subordinated debt to a concessionary investor. And this, as I mentioned, will be funding provided by the government of Taiwan, coming through a vehicle called the Women's Catalyst Fund. So that subordinated debt accounts for about 10% of the capital and acts as a first loss protection. So if there's any hiccups, any defaults on the underlying bonds, any losses are first absorbed by that subordinated debt before bondholders have to bear any losses. The proceeds of the bonds and the subdebt are then lent to the borrowers. The loans are 4-year loans, matching the 4-year life of the bond. Each of those loans is guaranteed by the US government. That's, as I mentioned, that guarantee comes through the US IDFC, but it's a full faith and credit guarantee of the US government, so AAA guarantee. We then IIX then monitors and those bonds, those loans throughout the life of the bond. We ensure a collection of interest and eventually principal on those loans, and then we return that capital to bondholders through coupon payments and eventual return of principal at maturity. Next slide, please. All throughout the 4-year life, we are providing both financial reporting that you would expect on any CLO, but we're also providing impact reporting on a semi-annual basis on each of the underlying borrowers and on the portfolio as a whole. So now, in a way, while we focus on the structure, and it's very important to understand the structure because there are a lot of credit protection elements built into the structure that protect bondholders. Ultimately, the most important part of the bond is the organizations that we're lending the proceeds of the bond to. They're important both because they're the primary source of repayment for the bonds, as they service the loans that we make to them. But they're also the way that the bond is creating impact through their work. So we are creating here, we have created a diversified portfolio of loans. We'll be lending to 8 different organizations across 4 countries in Asia. You can see here the breakup between India, which is the largest portion, somewhat over half, followed by Cambodia, the Philippines, and Indonesia. Importantly, over 3/4 of the loans will go to borrowers located in countries with a sovereign rating of investment grade. The only country here with a below investment grade rating is Cambodia, which will be limited to no more than 25% of the portfolio. The loans are also diversified by sector. So about 50% of the loans will go to borrowers who are microfinance institutions, for loans to women entrepreneurs to start micro businesses. That's actually many investors who are familiar with impact investing will recognize that as a well-established channel for impact investing, and I believe one that has proven to be very stable and creditworthy for investors over time. We're also, though, to diversify risk, lending to other organizations. A little more than 1/3 of the portfolio will go to organizations which are SME lenders. So they're making loans not necessarily to individuals to start very small businesses, but still lending to quite small businesses, making loans in the size of $2,000 to $20,000, for instance, lending to businesses that might be employing 5 or 10 people. So women-run businesses employing a small number of staff. We'll also be lending to sustainable agriculture businesses that are working with women smallholder farmers, and to ethical garment manufacturers. Next slide, please. And here, I won't spend much time on this, but this gives an overview of the 8 borrowers that we've selected. The information memorandum, which will be available to all investors, will provide complete details on each of these. But as you can see, the borrowers are located across 4 countries, across the sectors that I've mentioned. Most of them are quite mature organizations. Some have been in operation 20, 30, or more years. And most are, while not large organizations in the sense of in a kind of US developed markets context, are good-sized organizations in these frontier markets. So you'll see that many of the MFIs have loan portfolios ranging anywhere from $20 million up to nearly $100 million. So these are not by any means startups or early stage companies. These are mid-sized organizations in these markets. And they're ones that we have spent a lot of time assessing for creditworthiness. Next slide, please. And with that, I'd like to turn it back to Natasha to talk about the impact that we're targeting to achieve through the Women's Livelihood Bond 3.
Thank you, Robert. So over the last, I would say 6 to 9 months, as we've been developing the Women's Livelihood Bond portfolio, we've also spent extensive amount of time speaking directly to the women themselves who will be impacted by the bond. We've interviewed over 500 women. We've collected over 3,000 gender disaggregated data points as well. And we've used that to map the impact of the Women's Livelihood Bond 3, the 13 of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We have also formally partnered with the United Nations, 2 of the UN bodies, on this transaction, who've all gone through our impact assessment process in detail. as well. So they're a fantastic partner to have on this and a firm believer in the importance of investing in women. We will also be in compliance with the International Capital Markets Association social bond standards, as we've mentioned a few times, and IIX is on the advisory council for the green bond and social bond principles. So we're well in alignment with those. Through the Women's Savvy Bond 3, over the 4-year period, we're expecting for every dollar invested, we will generate $4 of social value, so a bit higher than we have in WLB1 and WLB2. And we're expecting to impact 180,000 underserved women and girls in the countries that we've mentioned. If we go to the next slide, we'll give a quick snapshot of this, perhaps, what this actually looks like on the ground. So these are 2 beneficiaries that we profiled from our last bond, who we've had the pleasure of speaking with over the last several months. The first story is from Amru Rice, a sustainable rice grower and exporter of organic rice based out of Cambodia, who was in our last issuance. So Bopa, who you see on the left-hand side of the screen, is actually someone I've met personally. Pre-pandemic, we actually had the pleasure of going down to the field and speaking to many of these women. Bopa had been selling her rice to Amru for a number of years, 5 years, and had been trained in selling organic rice. She was therefore able to increase her yield per harvest by 20% and gain about a $50 premium for organic rice she had sold. This not only helped her increase her total average income, but it also helps her have improved savings and in general financial resilience, which has a positive benefit on particularly her young daughters. Similarly, in the case of Agni, who is a beneficiary of Komedia, a microfinance entity out of Indonesia, Agni received a small business loan to set up a micro business in Indonesia, and as she built her credit worthiness, she was also able to get a water and sanitation loan to buy a water filter, and that helped her save 2 hours a day that she would have otherwise spent just collecting water from the city center. This time was instead allocated to working further in her business and spending more time with her young children as well. So again, we see a real ripple effect of investing in women, not just on themselves, but also on their family and their broader community, really shifting the narrative of women being victims to recognizing them as solutions to some systemic issues in the world today. I'll hand it back to Rob to go over the terms of the bond.
Thanks, Natasha. And I won't spend too much time on this because we've covered many of these points, but it is worth pointing out a few items here. So as we mentioned, we're targeting between a $25 and $30 million bond size to be issued out of the special purpose vehicle. And I should say this is, as any special purpose vehicle, this is set up only to issue the bonds and to use the proceeds to make loans. So there's no other liabilities besides the subordinated debt and no other activities of this SPV. The bond is a 4-year US dollar denominated bond that will be paying a standard semi-annual coupon. The rate is to be determined. As I mentioned, the WLB2 was a 4% coupon. We expect the WLB3 to come in just below that. I'll talk a little bit about why that is on the next slide when we compare some of the credit metrics of the 2 bonds. Minimum investment amount is $250,000. And I should mention here that in the US, we're selling as a Reg 144A, which means that the bond is suitable for qualified investors who are qualified institutional buyers and qualified purchasers. The rest of this, I think we've covered. I will say again that the bond will be listed on the Singapore Exchange and will be an ICMA social bond. Next slide, please. Very briefly on reporting, I mentioned before, but just to emphasize, we do all of the financial reporting that you would expect for a bond. So in fact, on a quarterly basis, we provide financial reports on the performance of the portfolio as a whole, but also on each individual loan. And then we also provide semi-annual impact reports. So twice a year, but at least once a year. That is, the data there is verified through actual communication with the underlying women who are impacted by the bond. Next slide, please. And here I'd like to just, I mentioned before that we expect the coupon on the WLB3 to be slightly below those of the WLB2. The reason for that is primarily that we are, because this bond is larger, we are able to offer a more diversified portfolio of loans underlying the bond, as well as a somewhat more larger and more mature borrower as well. So as I mentioned, the WLB3 will be lending the proceeds to 8 borrowers, whereas WLB2 had only 6 and WLB1 had only 3. So there's inherently more diversification there. The borrowers are also diversified across 4 countries, where WLB2 had 75% of its loans into Cambodia. WLB3 will limit that exposure to no more than 25%. Also, because our larger size bond, the average loan size is larger. It's $3.5 million, which means that we're generally lending to larger companies, more well-established companies with longer track records. I will also say, well, this doesn't really affect the pricing. It is important to us that the social return on investment for every dollar invested into the WLB3 is expected to be greater than those in the WLB2 or WLB1. You know, the last point really is that when we issued the WLB1, of course, it was the first of its kind. We love to do innovative things, but we also know that investors like to see something that has been proven and has worked before. And so now issuing the WLB3, now we have over 3.5 years of experience and track record, which we think is providing investors a significant amount of comfort. Next slide, please. On this next slide, I'll talk very briefly about how the Women's Livelihood Bond compares to other bonds that we recognize as having a very deep impact. So I'm not comparing it here to, for instance, a social bond that the Asian Development Bank or the IFC or the World Bank might issue. Those are very different structures. There you're lending basically on the balance sheet of the World Bank, AAA credit, which is very nice, but the amount of impact that that's creating is somewhat debatable. The Women's Livelihood Bond, as well as all of these structures here, are bonds that where the proceeds, you can be quite confident that the proceeds are going directly to organizations who are using that funding to expand their operations in a way that will have very direct and meaningful impacts on the underlying beneficiaries. So we think these are all good comparables from an impact standpoint, but I believe I put them up here to show how the WLB2 stacks up favorably from a return or risk and return standpoint. So I think maybe the best comparison is the WLB2, which is in the left-hand column, versus the responsibility microfinance bond in the second column. So both of these bonds are backed by diversified loan portfolios. The responsibility bond had a 25% first loss coverage, which is quite a significant credit protection. The WLB2, though, with a 12.5% first loss coverage plus a 50% guarantee by USAID, which actually means that the first 25% of any losses would have been split 50% to the first loss provider, 50% to USAID. None would have affected the bondholder. So that's as good as the responsibility protection, plus the USAID guarantee would pick up 50% of any losses beyond that. So it's actually a stronger set of credit protection. And yet we were able to offer a higher coupon on the WLB2 than responsibility was offering for its bond. I'd also say, just by comparison, that we are the only listed security shown here. and we're the only one that actually complies with the social bond principles and commits to detailed and transparent impact reporting throughout the life of the bond. Next slide, please. So this is really our, I believe, the last slide in the presentation, and I won't spend any time on this other than to say that as part of our commitment to, while we care greatly about the impact, we also care about presenting an instrument that is a stable, low-risk instrument for investors. And part of that commitment is to have an independent investment committee review all of the loans that we make. So I am on that investment committee together with our founder, Professor Doreen Shanaz, but we also have three outside finance professionals with deep background. So Kalpana Raina, who until she recently retired from the Bank of New York was one of the most senior South Asian women on Wall Street. We have Professor David Musto, who was until recently the head of the finance department at the Wharton School of Business and is still a faculty member there. And Mohit Rahman, who started his career over 30 years ago at Drexel Burnham Lambert and has been a credit investor ever since. Next slide, but I believe that's really the last substantive slide we have. The last thing I will say before we turn it over for Q&A is just a word on timing. So we have, for the last month or so, been speaking to large institutional investors to secure anchor orders. We have commitments now from several institutions. We are expect to spend maybe another week finalizing that. Once we have are able to announce the anchor investors, we will launch our banking partners will launch the offering more broadly. And at that time, we'll be open to family offices and other investors from the US as well as from around the world. So let me stop there and happy to take any questions.
Robert and Natasha, thank you so very much for the presentation. And yes, let's jump into Q&A. Again, to all of our attendees, we encourage those questions. So utilizing your questions chat option on your screen to submit any questions over. And let's see, we'll just kind of jump right in. First question, how do you mitigate risk factors for investors? Can you give an example of how the guarantee and sub-debt piece would kick in case of a default?
Yeah, good. So let me take that. And so I've talked about in broad terms how we're mitigating risk, but let me talk specifically about the mechanism for the first loss and the guarantee. I think we may have a slide on this. I'm not sure if we can pull it up, but let me just talk generally. So as I mentioned, the guarantee, the US government provides a partial guarantee of each and every one of the loans. So it's a 50% guarantee of principal. And maybe you can, yeah, we'll talk through this slide. So it's a 50% guarantee of principal. So that means if any of the loans, if we suffer a loss, if any of them fail to pay back the full principal amount, either at maturity or if they default and we accelerate the loan and we are not able to recover the full principal amount, USAID chips in 50% of any loss. So if we lose $1, they put in pay in 50 cents. If we lose $1 million, they pay in 500,000. If every single loan were to default and we were not to recover a single penny, they would pay in 50% of the loan portfolio into the structure. So that works in conjunction with the first loss capital. So the first loss capital is subordinated debt. It does not get paid back until the bonds are paid back in full. So which means, of course, that if there are any losses that are not covered by the USAID guarantee, they're absorbed by the subordinated debt until that up to the full amount of that debt. And only after that would bondholders begin to suffer any losses. So this graph, I'll describe what this is showing here. So this is assuming that we raised $30 million of capital, $27 million from bondholders, and $3 million from the Women's Catalyst Fund, which is our subordinated lender. In that case, the $3 million is provided by the subordinated debt, that's shown in the lower left-hand corner. 27 million is provided by bondholders. That's the three other boxes on this page. But what this is showing is that we could have if we had a scenario where we lost $6 million of our $30 million loan portfolio, which means, of course, that we'd have to have a larger amount than $6 million default after accounting for recoveries. But let's just assume we lose $6 million out of the 30 million, which is a fairly catastrophic scenario, considering we've never had a loss yet. And even in that case, though, what happens is USAID would, or the US government would, make good half of that amount. So they would pay $3 million into the structure. And the other $3 million would be absorbed by the Women's Catalyst Fund. And so even in that case, fairly catastrophic case, bondholders would not suffer any losses. They should expect to receive their full coupon and their full principal back at maturity. The divide between the dark blue and the light blue shows that even if losses were greater than that 6 million, USAID would continue to absorb 50% of any of those amounts, and bondholders would only absorb 50% of those losses. So long-winded answer, Lindsay, but hopefully that's cool.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Let's see, next question. How have the previous bonds performed, particularly in light of COVID-19?
Rob, you're muted.
That's a great question, Lindsay. So let me answer it from a financial standpoint, and then I'll ask Natasha to reflect on it from an impact standpoint. But from the Women's Livelihood Bond 2 was sold to investors in January, early January, and our loans were dispersed, really right before COVID hit. So we've been, since then, obviously very, very carefully monitoring both the portfolios of the WLB2 and the WLB1. And, by and large, we've been actually quite pleased with the performance of the underlying borrowers and of the loans. I'll say that at a high level, all of the loans are performing. We're receiving interest as scheduled from all of the underlying borrowers. So at that level, everything's going fine. At a business level, and as we analyze, we get monthly and financial data and more detailed data quarterly from each of the borrowers. And in fact, throughout the COVID period, have been having regular monthly calls with most of the borrowers. We're seeing how they're coping with the situation. Some are actually perversely having a benefiting from the situation. Amru Rice, that Natasha mentioned, is actually having a bumper year as the global demand for organic rice has shot up, as we've seen with some stockpiling. But we're also seeing many of the other borrowers for instance, in Cambodia, are also doing quite well. Unlike most of the West, particularly countries in Southeast Asia have had a less challenging time with COVID for a variety of reasons, and have not seen nearly as significant health impacts nor as significant impacts on the economy. I'd also like to think that because we're lending to businesses that are fundamentally benefiting the economies in which they're operating, they tend to have somewhat more resilience to crises, and I think we're seeing that play out through the COVID crisis as well.
Thanks, Robert. Let's see, next question, moving right along here. Robert, what would you say are the benefits of listing the WLB on the SGX?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, both the WLB1 and the WLB2 are listed, and the WLB3 will be listed on the Singapore Exchange. Now, these are listings. They trade in minimum lot sizes of 200,000 Singapore dollars, and so in reality, we have not seen any trading of either the WLB1 or WLB2, and frankly, we wouldn't expect to see trading of the WLB3 at only a $30 million size. As our bond issues get larger over time, we might see that, but not at this size. Nevertheless, we think there are significant benefits of listing. First of all, there's a transparency and credibility element to that. Naturally, we have to comply with a variety of listing requirements for the bond to be listed, and then we have to comply on a continuing basis with a variety of reporting obligations as well. So I think those are important. We also find that a number of the institutional investors that have invested in the bond are required, or limited, I should say, to buying only listed securities. So it gives them comfort as well.
Wonderful, thank you. Next question, which I actually really like this question. How do you verify the women's lives actually improve?
Yeah, that's a great question. Natasha, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the most important things is that the women themselves are given a voice and a value in the investment decision-making process. So there's a two-part process that we go through. The first is pre-issuance. When we are constructing the portfolio, as we've mentioned, we spend time speaking with the women. So we've looked at, for the Women's Livelihood Bond 3 as an example, 345 companies from our broader database went through screening surveys on credit and impact. We narrowed that down to 40 companies who made it through the initial criteria on the impact side as well. And then we due diligence to 12. When we actually conduct a live due diligence, we actually do speak directly to randomly selected groups of women. When we speak to these women, we actually verify whether the businesses that we are hoping to invest in, their products and services actually help the women to improve their livelihoods and therefore their lives as well. And then we're able to put financial proxies to that. So it's all human-centered, but very data-driven, as we like to say. We then use that for the shortlisted companies, 8 companies in this case, to do forward-looking projections. So this is not as you would do in traditional philanthropy, where measurement is more retrospective. Once you deploy, say, a grant, you would go back and see what the impact has been. In the case of an investment, you want to look in a forward-looking way and say, if we're going to deploy $30 million, what's the kind of impact that we'll see over the 4 years across the 8 companies? And then we use the data that the women have given us to set up what we call impact targets for all the entities in the portfolio. Then the second phase, which is post-issuance, every year we actually go back, again, speak to randomly selected groups of women so we can actually test our assumptions and make sure that we're able to accurately quantify how the women's lives have been changed. In comparison, most investors in the region would either only do the assessment on the company who they're lending to and not speak to the women, or they would at most speak to, on average, we've heard 5 or 6 women, maybe to do a profile in a report. We, by comparison, interview hundreds of women at a time. And now with our digital impact assessment tool, even during the COVID pandemic, we'll be able to continue to send digital surveys. So we're able to, on an ongoing basis, collect data and then do reporting in a very transparent manner. So you're hearing directly from the women themselves on whether something has worked or not.
Natasha, great, super helpful. I appreciate that. That does seem to be all the questions that have come through so far. So Robert or Natasha, if there's anything that you'd like to add in closing, now would be the time.
Well, first, let me just thank everyone for joining, and Lindsay, thank you for organizing this. All I will say is that this, while we would actually welcome anybody who's interested in learning more to reach out directly to us. We will ultimately, though, be selling through our placement agent partners, and so this would be flow through your banking contact, but we are very, very happy to be the first round of contact and to answer any questions directly and to help with your due diligence process. As I mentioned, we should have an information memo available frankly in the next couple of days that can be distributed to interested parties. So look forward to hearing interest from yourselves.
Thanks, Robert. Yes, to all of our attendees, this is Lindsay with Family Office Networks. We will be following up with all of you individually, so if there's any questions that you have still, we will get you in direct contact with the team. We thank everyone for joining us today, and we hope you guys all have a great day. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.